Jill, can you go ahead and do us the honor of call and roll, please?
Yes. Mr. Rosensteel?
Here.
Ms. Hendricks?
Here.
Ms. Vargas? For the Director of Finance, Ms. Wong Hernandez?
Here.
Chairperson Dillon, you have a quorum.
Thank you very much. Brian, you ready?
Yes, I am. Thank you. I wanted a minute to offer a reminder that these discussions, we're talking about compensation for staff. And so it is the role of the committee in conjunction with HR and outside advisors to make these decisions, have these discussions. And staff who are affected by the actual decisions should have no role in the discussion unless the committee needs advice on a practical matter. So I want to, since they're interested parties, I just want to caution staff and the committee against relying too heavily on staff's input.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Brian. All righty. First item up is to approve our agenda. I'd entertain a motion to do so.
Okay.
It's been moved by Nora, seconded by Sharon. All in favor, say aye. All opposed, nay. Any abstentions? All righty, we're going to turn to our first order of business, which is our minutes. You have a new copy of the minutes before you. There were some changes made. It's been updated on the website, and I'd entertain a motion to adopt the amended minutes. Okay, it's been moved by Sharon, seconded by Paul. Are there any questions? All right, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Any abstentions?
Abstaining.
Thanks. We still get it passed, right, with the 2 abstentions?
Yes.
All right, cool. And then moving on, Melissa,
Okay,
you're up for item 3.
yes, good morning, everyone. This is a technical housekeeping item, and it reflects updates to benchmark definitions for inflation-sensitive and innovative strategies included in the administrative procedures of the compensation policy. For innovative strategies, new indices are being included in the dynamically weighted Innovative Strategies Index beginning February of 2018, specifically including 2 non-US low volatility funds. And for inflation sensitive, the index is being updated to include timber and agriculture funds. Both revisions are reflected in attachment 1 of the item. And this request does update the benchmark definitions for inflation sensitive and innovative strategies, staff incentive compensation evaluation portion, and aligns their performance to the expected investment objectives. Staff recommends the update be adopted by the Compensation Committee to be effective for the 2017-18 performance year. And with that, I'll pass it back to the committee for any questions.
Melissa, just because I had the question, can we go ahead and talk about that a little bit?
Sure.
So
Are
I
you
had a
referring to?
question on page 3, when it talked about the custom index returns, that the returns from June 14 to 15 were ex-tobacco and firearms, and the prior to that, the 02 to 14 were just ex-tobacco. And so I was curious as what that change was now. So Melissa, if you could.
Yeah, and so if you see the addition of the text, it talks about CalSTR's restricted securities list since July of 2015. And so that security list is really expanded to include additional restrictions in addition to ex-tobacco and ex-firearms. So it's an extensive list that I can definitely share with the committee. Investment staff did provide it to me. So it's covering those 2 as well going forward.
Is there anyone interested from the committee having that information? If so, get a hold of Melissa. How's that?
Sure.
All right.
I can't
Go ahead.
figure out how to get on now. It's just, I can open my mic, but I can't request to speak.
You have your request to speak? No? Sharon, do you have yours?
I don't have a request.
I don't either.
Okay, we're gonna take a 5-minute break. Can you access your mic?
I can, yeah. I can,
We'll do it in between meetings. How's that? Go ahead.
Okay.
So I don't have a question specifically on this. I have sort of a comment, which is that I think we have, our standards or our benchmarks for evaluating staff continue to get more and more and more complex. And there's always this problem of, on the one hand, we have the benchmark being what we want them staff to do, but on the other hand, it gets so complex it becomes by definition what they're doing. So if you make the benchmark so confusing that if they decide to invest in this fund, then that fund gets added to the benchmark, then what happens is that all we're doing is judging them by what they're already doing. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but, and I know we always have that problem. I'm not going to question this. What I am going to question, though, and it probably gets to what we do when we do our asset allocation. Our asset allocation study is based on expected returns. And what we're telling staff is to seek the returns in these now exceptionally complex benchmarks. But the returns that we're plugging into our asset allocation model are very different. You know, infrastructure is just CPI plus, I think it's 400. Maybe we change it to 300. So it's very simple, and they're not consistent. And so it seems to me that we need some consistency. That what we're asking the staff to do is to achieve the assumptions we put into the asset allocation. Otherwise, the asset allocation is kind of meaningless because it doesn't really reflect what we're likely to be getting, because we're judging staff on a different basis. So I don't know if this is a question for our investment consultants, if it's who it's a question for, but it seems to me that what we're doing here in compensation and what we're doing in investments needs to be consistent.
Thank you, Paul. So Melissa, Cassandra, do either one of you want to speak about the conversation we had about developing process? Because it almost seems like when we have that conversation, that Paul's issue could be wrapped up into that.
You mean the broader discussion about policy and how that impacts then compensation? Possibly, yes. And Stephen, you're the expert in this area, but I would say that these unique benchmarks, because they're dynamically weighted, and so the addition of these, to your point, Paul, will continue and get more complex. So I'm going to stop. I don't want to muddy up.
And I can speak to it a little bit too. We've had the conversation about when changes to the asset classes are made, then having more of a policy evaluation on how do we handle those changes to that investment policy in the context of our compensation policy, and having it referred to our compensation consultants and our HR staff to evaluate it from a policy perspective, rather than looking at it incrementally as we are making changes in the investment policy and how it impacts the incentive compensation. So that's one of the processes that we would like to put in place a little bit more rigidly, so that we can look at it at a little bit more detailed level.
So Paul, do you think that the issue you're bringing up would have a place in that as we start to have that discussion?
I'm not sure. I'm not, to be honest, I'm not quite sure I understood, Cassandra, what you just said. I just think that this board goes through a process with an asset allocation. And in doing so, we're saying this is how much risk we're willing to take for this much return that we expect to earn. And I mean, the last time we went through the discussion, we had a debate between our two consultants as to how granular should we be in defining asset classes. PCA had a very small number of asset classes that they wanted, and Makita had a very large number of granular asset classes. But what comes to us is not a reflection of those asset classes or our expected returns. So that are incorporated into our asset allocation. And so what we're doing is what worries me is we're creating incentives. Staff is going to manage to what these benchmarks are. That's what they should do. That's what we want them to do. That's why we create these benchmarks. But if these benchmarks are getting them to seek to get a different combination of assets or a different combination of risks and returns that's inconsistent with the assumptions that were in our asset allocation, then we're not managing toward that asset allocation. And that's the only question. I just want to make sure that that there's consistency here. And as we get more complex, it seems that we're deviating from that.
All right, Stephen, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. I think a lot of that difference between the indexes that you would use for incentive compensation versus the asset allocation policy is a time frame issue. The board is addressing asset allocation return expectations of that asset allocation over a 20-plus year period. Incentive compensation is measured over a 3-year period. So a lot of the taken to the extreme, if the incentive comp was based on the expected return of the entire asset allocation, 7.3 or 4%, whatever it is today, there'd be a lot of variability year to year on meeting that, and almost all that variability would not be under the control of the staff. So I think when you're developing benchmarks for incentive compensation, you want to be careful to both capture decisions staff has control over in order to outperform those benchmarks, and also select benchmarks where they make sense in the context of the time horizon of the incentive compensation, which doesn't match the time horizon of the asset allocation. I think it's a very valid point that the board needs to be cognizant that in the aggregate, all of these custom indexes that are included to sort of better match how staff is investing, in the aggregate, match the overall risk profile of the pension fund. Because I completely understand your point that you don't want to disconnect between the board adopting an asset allocation that accepts a certain type and level of risk, and then have incentive compensation that through various decision-making processes results in indexes that don't reflect that risk.
That's exactly
I think that can be done separately. I think the consultants can help kind of draw that line to get the board comfortable with that, and something that's worth doing.
And maybe the answer is just that we could hear from our investment consultants that these custom indexes are not inconsistent with what we've done. And then I think, because you make a good point. I mean, we're looking, asset allocation is long run, incentive compensation is 3 years. They're not necessarily going to be the same, but it would be, good for the board to know that there's some consistency here. So that would be.
Go ahead, Neil.
Just to tag on to your thought, I don't see, typically we've come through the process and looking at incentive comp and looking at a lot of benchmarks along with Makita. We write these opinion memos. One part of those opinion memos could make a statement that confirms exactly what you're asking for. That would not be a problem.
Right.
So,
Perfect.
thanks.
Perfect, thank you. Thank you.
And if that works into what we're looking at as policy, we could work that into it also. Okay, cool, thank you. All right, this is an action item. Are there any questions on item 3? Seeing none, I'd entertain a motion to approve.
So moved.
Moved by Paul, seconded by Nora. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. Any abstentions? The motion is passed. Alyssa, back to you for item number 4.
Okay, this is going to be providing the committee with an update on the progress of the RMS asset class. The committee requested to have periodic check-ins on the RMS implementation and whether changes to quantitative and/or qualitative weightings should be considered. Makita has provided an opinion memo in the item as an attachment with their analysis and recommendation. Specifically, Makita opines that although RMS has reached its allocation target of 8%, the portfolio is not fully implemented, and staff is still reviewing strategies that are expected to be fully funded by the end of this calendar year 2018, and recommends that the committee keep the current RMS weightings and revisit its incentive structure again in early 2019. Stephen is here if the committee has any questions. This is an information item, and if the committee wishes to review the RMS incentive structure again, a placeholder has been included in the 2018-19 Compensation Committee work plan as a consideration. And with that, I will pass it back to you, Dana.
Any questions from committee members? So, go ahead. And for you guys, it was a setting on my control. So I changed it to request to speak, so we're good. All righty. I forgot to say that. All right, Sharon?
So Stephen, your recommendation's based on, I want to just make sure I understand that we're 8% allocation and our goal is 9%, correct? So is that why you're suggesting to wait until next
I think you're, I don't know what date we're looking at. I think you're at your 9%
Okay.
target. So the nuance is you've reached your investment target, but if you remember, the RMS portfolio consists of 4 subcategories. Those 4 subcategories haven't yet been fully built out. So the dollars are there, but they're not in the mix that yet that was approved by the board. That'll be completed by the end of this year. And so the primary basis for our recommendation is that you should wait until the portfolio is fully implemented before readdressing the qualitative versus quantitative factors. The secondary consideration is this is because the role of this asset class is both to beat the benchmarks, but I would argue more importantly to truly protect in a market downturn. This is an asset class that long-term you may want to consider always having a somewhat higher weight to qualitative factors.
Thank you, Stephen. I have a question. I imagine that other systems are playing with their asset classes just like we are. Do you know of anyone that's doing something like what we're trying to do and how they're structuring their incentives?
Well, I'd say the vast majority of systems out there don't have incentive compensation for staffs.
Okay.
So it's not a massive universe of groups to judge. Groups are challenged with benchmarking for policy purposes, these types of portfolios. And I would say it's a industry best practice that's not yet evolved in terms of the right benchmark to use for these. I think your current benchmark, which is a roll-up of constituent benchmarks for strategies in the group, is probably the best way to benchmark the category presently.
All right, super, thank you, I appreciate that. All righty, any further questions on 4? Would we like to see this come back to us in the next year? Stephen, and come back next year? All righty, so Melissa, let's get this on our work plan. All righty, and on to number 5.
So this is the committee's 2018-19 work plan input. And in the item, there are recommended activities for the 2018-19 year. I can go through those with the committee at this time. And if there's any questions, just let me know. We have recommended for July of 2018 a placeholder for investment policy changes impacting compensation. So those are areas where if from the investment committee that flow into the compensation committee, ensuring that we have a placeholder to address that. Then in September, we have our annual trigger review, which includes investment performance triggers, ethics violation triggers, and reputational risk. In November, we have a recommended activity to launch your biennial salary analysis for the executive investment positions. And then in November, the disclosure of incentives, which That's your annual disclosure there as a placeholder. In May, we have proposed the labor market benchmarking coming back to the committee, similar to what we did a couple of years ago. This was a request that came from you, Dana, to make sure that we're consistently doing it on a every other year cycle. Then also in May, we inserted the RMS evaluation per our discussion just now. And in May, we have another placeholder for policy updates to the teachers' compensation policy. And then in May, we also have the work plan input, which is just kind of full cycle, again, reviewing what we want for the 2019-20 year. In May, we also have recommended, which I believe all the other committees will be doing as well, the committee charter review. And that'll be an opportunity to take a look at those bullets that are highlighted in the item in the very beginning of the committee's responsibilities and going over those. I know, Dana, you and I had a conversation specifically about a couple of those, and perhaps that would be a good time to either clarify the language or give an update on what staff is doing in that regard. I will recommend, per the update to the minutes from November, it's not included in the item here, but to add the investment officer 2-3 incentive opportunity, that salary analysis that McLaughlin is doing for us, to come back to the committee perhaps in July as a placeholder, if that's okay with the committee? Okay, so I'll go ahead and add that. We talked about, Cassandra spoke about it, that broader kind of education on policy impacts and how does the committee want to address those in the compensation incentive area. So if you'd like, we can also consider adding something to the compensation committee, perhaps as an education or governance item. Okay. And then if there's anything else, the committee would also
I do have a speaker. Nora?
like to
I just
add.
need a clarification. So the labor market benchmarking happens in November and in May?
So in November, I'll come to the committee. It's kind of kicking off that, that effort to share with you what we're going to be requesting from McLaughlin. And at that time, if the committee has any special request or wants staff to consider areas as we work with McLaughlin, then I would take that feedback and then give direction to McLaughlin.
And then is May sufficient time for budget purposes or?
It should be fine from my understanding. Yeah. Yeah.
Paul?
Thank you. Melissa, I thought I heard you say that one of the issues that will come before us has to do with reputational risk. But I didn't see anything in the written presentation about that. What are you referring to?
I added a little bit more context to the description of, it's the investment performance impact on incentive pay for 2017-18 plan year. I referenced it as the annual trigger review, and it encompasses the investment performance. There's 3 items that is presented to the board, and ethics violation and reputational risk are included in that, that we would bring to the committee. So it was just a descriptor of the overall topic.
Overall.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Right. That does it for our speakers, Melissa. Do you have anything else on this item?
No.
If you have any other ideas after this meeting's over, go ahead and email me, and Melissa and I will have a conversation, and we can get that onto the work plan too. All right. Review of information requests. I think, Jill, the only thing we had, we've already taken care of because we put it on the work plan.
Yes.
All righty. Draft agenda for the next committee meeting. Melissa, do you want to go over that at all?
The only update would be to bring the IO2 and 3, if it's added to the work plan for 2018, that this would be a placeholder for in July.
Okay. Any statements from the public? Committee's adjourned.